Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my name's Meg, for those of you that don't know. And then the title of my presentation is Methods of Testing Sound Localization Performance in Normal Hearing Children. So Rachel and Ariel gave a great intro onto binaural hearing and specifically sound localization. So I'm just going to jump right into my presentation. Oops, sorry. So here's an outline of my presentation. I'll go through a little bit of background research, present our current study, and then talk about a future research direction, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So our research question was, how have children performed in sound localization tasks? So normal hearing children aged 5 and children with bilateral cochlear implants aged 5 to 14 were tested on a sound localization task in a 2010 Greco-Caleb and Litovsky study. The child was seated in front of an array of loudspeakers in the horizontal plane. As you can see from this animation, the loudspeakers have symbols which the child can use to help identify the location of the sound source. A speech signal was played from one of the loudspeakers, and then the child selected the loudspeaker by which symbol they heard it from on a touchscreen. So this is known as a sound source identification task. So here are the results from one of the normal hearing children in this study. The x-axis is the location of the target sound source, and the y-axis is the child's response. So looking at this first normal hearing child, you notice that the dots have a fairly linear relationship on the graph, meaning that the location that the child chose for their response was often where the target location was, or not very far from it. So if the target signal came from positive 20, on the graph, as you can check, the child responded that the location was anywhere from about 14 to 23 degrees. So sometimes they responded it was at 18, sometimes 14, sometimes 20 degrees. So they were very close to where the target signal was coming from. So the RMS, which is in bold at the top and which Rachel went over in her presentation, stands for the root mean square error, and that's the average number of degrees the child's response is from the target. So on average, this child's responses were 8.9 degrees from the target. So they also found in this study that other normal hearing children were able to localize with that same linear pattern. However, there were also some normal hearing children in the study that did not have this same pattern of localization. So you notice now that the dots don't fall as neatly along the line, and in fact that several dots are spread in the gray boxes. So now, for example, with normal hearing child number 6, when the target was at 20 degrees, for this child, the child said it was anywhere between 10 and 60 degrees. So they were not nearly as close as that first child. So this pattern was seen in other normal hearing children in the study and was actually comparable to some of the bilateral cochlear implant users in the study. So then looking at another study, done by Moua et al. In 2016, normal hearing children and adults were tested on an auditory motion experiment. The children tested in their study were between 11 and 16 years old. This is a picture of the setup, and the child is seated in the middle of a loudspeaker array in front of a touchscreen computer with speakers ranging from -90 to positive 90 degrees. As you can see, unlike the previous study where the child had symbols corresponding to each speaker, there are now no symbols to help indicate the location of the loudspeaker. In this study, both stationary and moving sounds were randomly presented. However, for this presentation, I'll only be focusing on the data from when the children localized a stationary sound source. So when the child pressed the play button, a stationary sound source was presented, they would make a response by indicating the perceived location along this arc. In this picture, the response indicated by that blue dot was at -90 degrees, or to the far left of the child. The child has the opportunity to select any point along the arc, rather than those discrete locations identified by the symbols, making the response options much larger than when the child selects the response based on one of the symbols. This method is known as a continuous method and is a more realistic representation of localization abilities in the real world, since typically there are not symbols identified to help us locate sounds. So here are the stationary sound localization results from that study. The x-axis is the location of the target sound source, and the y-axis is the child's response. The RMS, which is again bolded at the top of the graph, stands for the root mean square error, and it's the average number of degrees the child's response is from the target. Each circle on the graph represents the child's response compared to the location of the target signal. As you can see, some of the children performed similarly to the normal hearing children in the previous study. Their responses were linear, and their RMS errors were low. Other children in the study performed similar to the bilateral cochlear implant users in the previous study. Their responses were spread throughout the graph, and their RMS errors were higher or poorer. Additionally, one child in the study was localizing at chance level, and as you can see, that child's responses are completely spread across the graph. There's no linear pattern identified, and the RMS error is 57.8 degrees. So based on the varying localization patterns seen in these two studies, we wanted to see which factors may be affecting the response patterns of some of these normal hearing children. So a few factors that have been identified in the literature to affect testing localization ability in children include attention, fatigue to task, age, task comprehension, and method of testing. So for our study, we looked at the impact of method of testing on sound localization ability in normal hearing children. Specifically, we looked at how children performed when tested in a method similar to the Moua et al. Study and when tested via the method used in the Greco-Caleb study. So the purpose of our study was to determine if normal hearing children's performance on a sound localization task is impacted by the response method of testing. So for our study, we tested 11 children aged 5 to 10 with bilateral pure tone thresholds below 20 decibels. We tested the children in two conditions, the continuous and discrete. In the first condition, the continuous condition, the child is seated in the middle of a loudspeaker array in front of a touchscreen computer with speakers ranging from -90 to +90 degrees. As you can see, there are no symbols, again, corresponding to the loudspeakers. The child touches the play button, the target signal is played somewhere along the array, and then the child selects on the touch screen the location of the sound source. The second condition the children were tested in was the discrete condition. In the discrete condition, each speaker has a corresponding symbol. The child again selects the play button from the touch screen, the sound is played, and then the child selects the symbol that corresponds to the location of the sound source. Each trial, the child is given feedback where the correct speaker location is revealed. So this is the raw data from one normal hearing child in the continuous condition. So again, the x-axis is the location of the target sound source, and the y-axis is the child's response. The RMS, again bolded at the top of the graph, stands for the root mean square error, and it's the average number of degrees the child's response is from the target. So this child's responses deviated from the target an average of 9.2 degrees, which is really good. The child was not only able to tell that the target was to the left or right, but was able to get 9 degrees on average away from it. What we can also see from the child's results is that linear pattern of responses. And results of other children in the study showed a similar response pattern for that continuous condition. When looking at the same 4 children in the discrete condition, or the condition where they had the symbols, the response patterns do not change much. This tells us that despite there being more variability in response choices and a lack of feedback in that continuous condition, these normal hearing children's response patterns remained fairly linear compared to their performance in the discrete condition. So now this is a graph showing the average of all the participants' RMS across both conditions. The average RMS in the continuous condition was about 10.5 degrees, and the average in the discrete was about 9 degrees. So on average, normal hearing children had a similar pattern of localization across both the continuous and the discrete conditions. So now when comparing our results in the continuous condition to those seen in that Moua et al. Study, a large difference in the average RMS is noted, with the Moua et al. Being much higher or poorer than the average seen in our results. So one difference to note about this difference between our study and the Moua study is that the children in the Moua study were randomly presented with both those stationary and moving sounds. So that could have been confusing to the child as to when they were supposed to localize a stationary sound versus something that was moving. And then similarly, comparing our results in the discrete condition to those in the Greco-Caleb and Litovsky study from 2010, the average RMS error in the Greco-Caleb and Litovsky study was higher or poorer than that seen in our study in the same condition. So one thing to note about this difference is that the normal hearing children in the Greco-Caleb and Litovsky study were all 5 years old, whereas we had a range from 5 to 10 years old. Additionally, in our study, the children were tested in the discrete condition following testing in that condition, in the continuous condition, whereas the children in the Greco-Caleb and Litovsky study were only tested in the discrete condition. So the children in our study could have benefited from a learning effect. So this brings us to the conclusions that on average, normal hearing children's response patterns on a sound localization task were similar when using a discrete or a continuous method of testing. And that those factors I mentioned in the previous slide, like including age, learning effect, and task comprehension, among other factors, may account for the differences seen between our results and the results in those previous studies. So one of the future research directions would be to isolate those factors that affect normal hearing children's sound localization performance patterns, including fatigue to task, age, attention, and learning effect. All right, so I just wanted to give a special thank you to everyone in the binaural hearing and speech lab, especially Keng for being super helpful throughout this whole process and answering all my questions and working with me countless weekends. Dr. Ruth Litovsky for reviewing my presentation and my PowerPoint. Shelley for helping organize all paperwork and trainings. My Capstone committee for reviewing my paper and my PowerPoint. All of the participants and their families. As Rachel mentioned, it's a long test that they sit through, and so thank you to them for that. And then also, just wanted to mention that this work was funded by the NIH and IDCD. All right, and there are my references. Does anyone have any questions? Dr. Hartman?
I'm just curious, did one method take more or less time?
So her question was, what did one method take more or less time? And I think the discrete method ended up taking a lot more time just because a lot of them did it right after they did the continuous, and by that time they were kind of sick of it. But the continuous did take a long time too because we had to kind of redirect them a lot and tell them, all right, remember, it can be from anywhere on the arc. And so, yeah, it was a lot of patience, with a lot of breaks in between with fun games and stuff. And, but yeah, it was a long time for the kids to do. So we had a lot of them come back multiple times for testing. Go ahead.
I know you said there wasn't any feedback, but was there any training period beforehand where they had some feedback? Or?
So I think only 2 of the children that we tested had like a trial before we actually started the experiment. So they had like a just a quick trial run where they were kind of oriented to the speaker array, not told where the locations were, but how to do the task and things like that. But most of them were able to kind of jump right in and get what was going on. We had little like pictures that with the setup and everything that kind of helped explain. And then actually for almost all of the children, I sat with them inside the booth for the whole test. So I was helping them stay on task for sure. Dr. Fowler?
I wanted to ask you about any kind of history of where diseases had and how that might affect their ability to make localization.
Yeah, so actually that's a good question. We didn't look at any of the, we didn't ask about any ear infection history, anything like that. We screened all the kids to see if they had normal hearing, but that would be something we could look into to see how it would impact that. We just didn't do that for this part of the study. All right, thank you.